In the heart of New York City, on a quiet October morning in 1921, an old man sat alone at his desk. His name was Bat Masterson. He wasn't holding a gun anymore, only a typewriter. The man who once stared down outlaws under the burning sun was now fighting a new kind of battle, a race against time, memory, and his own fading heartbeat. His fingers danced over the keys, clicking like distant gunshots echoing across the prairie. Then suddenly, silence. The typewriter stopped. When they found him, he was still sitting there, slumped gently in his chair, a half-finished article before him. The words on the page read, "There are no bullies in the fight game, because defeat is only one punch away." That was the last thing Bat Masterson ever wrote. And maybe that single sentence said everything about the man himself. But who was Bat Masterson? This man who lived two completely different lives. To some, he was a lawman, a gunfighter, a living legend of the Wild West. To others, he was a journalist, a storyteller, a gentleman in a bowler hat. His life was a bridge between two Americas, the dusty frontier and the rising city of steel. Let's go back. Before the fame, before the guns, before the myths. Bat Masterson was born Bartholomew William Barclay Masterson in 1853 in a small farming village in Quebec, Canada. His parents were Irish immigrants, hardworking and poor, raising 7 children in a world that demanded toughness and faith. From the start, Bat was different. He wasn't loud or wild, and he was calm, sharp, and curious. He had that quiet confidence that makes others follow without question. But life on the northern plains was hard. When Bat was still a boy, his family moved south to Kansas, hoping for a better life. The land was rough, the winters were cruel, and every day was a fight to survive. The Kansas prairie was wild, filled with buffalo, wind, and danger. That's where Bat grew into a man. By the time he was 20, Bat had already seen more death than most men ever would. He joined his brothers, Ed and Jim, working as buffalo hunters, one of the toughest jobs in America. The Great Plains were filled with opportunity and violence. Each sunrise meant another day chasing herds across miles of open land, their rifles echoing through the dust. The hunters made money selling hides to railroad towns, but every trip carried risk. There were outlaws. There were storms. And there were battles, real battles, with Native American warriors defending their land. In 1874, Bat found himself in one of the most famous fights of the frontier. The Second Battle of Adobe Walls. He was just 21. A small group of buffalo hunters had taken shelter in a trading post when hundreds of Comanche and Kiowa warriors attacked. The air was filled with gunfire, smoke, and terror. Bullets cracked through wooden walls. Arrows rained from the sky. For days, the hunters held their ground, hungry, tired, and scared. Most men would have run, but Bat stayed. That was the day courage stopped being a word and became something real to him. After Adobe Walls, people began to whisper his name. He wasn't famous yet, but his reputation was growing, the calm young man who didn't flinch under fire. He learned that the West wasn't just about strength. It was about nerve. And Bat Masterson had nerve in abundance. He moved from town to town, Dodge City, Denver, and others still carving themselves out of the wilderness. Each one was filled with drifters, gamblers, and men who settled arguments with bullets. And somehow Bat fit right in, but he wasn't like the others. He dressed better. He talked softer. He smiled when others scowled. Even then, people called him the gentleman of the frontier. He didn't fight to prove himself. He fought when he had to. He didn't chase glory. He chased order. The idea that the West didn't have to be chaos forever. One night in Dodge City, years later, someone would say, there are 2 kinds of lawmen, those who want to shoot and those who have no choice but to. Bat Masterson was the second kind, and soon the town of Dodge, the wildest place in America, would call on him to bring peace where there was none. But that part of the story comes later. For now, imagine him standing on the open plains at sunset, his rifle slung across his shoulder, his eyes scanning the horizon, the wind whipping through the tall grass, carrying the promise of change. That was the world Bat Masterson was born into, a world where legends weren't born in cities or books. They were forged under the endless sky, one bullet, one breath, one heartbeat at a time, and that is where his legend begins. The dusty streets of Dodge City were quiet that morning, but it was the kind of quiet that carried tension, the kind of silence that came before a storm. The wind blew through the empty alleys, picking up bits of straw and dirt, swirling them in little ghosts of dust. On the wooden porch of the Alhambra saloon, Bat Masterson leaned against a post, watching. His hand rested easily on the handle of his revolver, not out of fear, but habit. It was 1877, and Dodge City wasn't just another town. It was chaos with a name. Cowboys, drifters, gamblers, and gunmen filled the streets. Men came there for money, women, and whiskey, and many never left alive. The law was a badge worn thin by fear, but Bat had never been afraid of chaos. He'd seen worse, and now he was ready to face it. He had come a long way from the Buffalo Plains. The boy who had hunted bison was now a man trusted with the town's safety. He had already earned respect in the roughest corners of the West, and his calm confidence made people listen. That same calmness was what got him elected as sheriff of Ford County. The town needed someone with steady hands, not a wild trigger finger, and Bat fit that role perfectly. Wyatt Earp was already in Dodge, serving as assistant marshal. He and Bat quickly formed a quiet friendship based on mutual respect. Wyatt was fast and sharp, but he admired Bat's cool temper. Where Wyatt charged in, Bat thought first. Together, they made an unlikely team, two men trying to bring order to a place that didn't want it. Being sheriff in Dodge City was no simple task. There were no rules, only tempers. A man could get killed for a bad look or a wrong word. Bat's first job was to remind everyone that the law still meant something. He didn't rely on fear. He relied on presence. He walked the streets with his head high, speaking softly, but carrying authority in every glance. People said Bat could talk his way out of anything, and most times he did. He preferred a conversation to a gunfight, and it often worked. But when it didn't, when the talking stopped and the guns came out, Bat was fast enough to end it. Not the fastest maybe, but calm, always calm. His reputation grew. Men began to think twice before drawing their pistols in Dodge City. The saloon owners respected him. The cattlemen obeyed him. And the troublemakers feared him. For a while it almost felt like peace. But peace in the Wild West was never built to last. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned to fire, Bat's brother, Ed Masterson, walked the same streets wearing the same badge. Ed had followed in Bat's footsteps, proud to wear the star of a lawman. But being sheriff in Dodge was a dangerous honor. The brothers often talked about the day they could both leave the West behind, find a quieter life. But that day never came. In April 1878, gunfire split the night. Ed had gone to break up a fight near the Comique Saloon. Within seconds, shots rang out. When Bat heard them, he ran through the streets, heart pounding, dust rising with every step. He found his brother on the ground, bleeding from the chest. Bat knelt beside him. Ed tried to speak, but his voice was gone. Within minutes, he was dead. The witnesses pointed to the men who had done it. Two drunks, guns still warm. Bat rose slowly, his eyes cold. He didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight to them, drew his revolver, and fired. 2 shots. Both men fell. After that night, Bat didn't talk much about his brother. People said he changed. The calm stayed, but something softer, something human, had burned away. He was still the gentleman of the West, but behind those eyes was loss that never healed. Word spread fast. Some said Bat had avenged his brother. Others said he was just another killer, but those who knew him understood. Bat Masterson didn't shoot for revenge. He shot for justice. He finished his term as sheriff, and for a while Dodge City grew quieter. The violence eased, the fear faded. People could walk the streets again without watching their backs. And when they did, they tipped their hats to the man who had made that possible. But Bat wasn't a man to stay still. He had done what he came to do. He brought order where there was none. And when the frontier finally started to change, when the law caught up with the wild, Bat knew his time there was done. He moved on, leaving Dodge behind, heading west again. He gambled, managed saloons, and promoted boxing matches. He became a figure of charm and style, always dressed sharp, always composed. He carried the same confidence he once used to face gunmen, only now he used it in card rooms and theaters. People called him the dandy of the West, half teasing, half admiring. But Bat didn't mind. He had lived through the blood and fire of the frontier. He had earned the right to enjoy what peace he could find. Yet deep down, he never forgot Dodge City. He never forgot his brother. The West had given him fame and respect. but it had also taken more than it gave. Bat Masterson had become a legend, but legends, he knew, were never just stories of victory. They were stories of pain, sacrifice, and survival. As he rode away from Dodge for the last time, the wind followed him, whispering across the plains that had made him who he was. Behind him lay the town he tamed. Ahead lay the unknown, and for a man like Bat Masterson, the unknown was exactly where he belonged. The West was changing. Railroads cut across the plains, towns were rising, and the old ways of life were slowly fading into dust. For Bat Masterson, Dodge City was behind him now. The sheriff's badge that once shone on his chest was gone, replaced by a fine suit, polished boots, and a gambler's smile. He wasn't a lawman anymore, not in the official sense, but in every room he entered, you could feel the quiet authority he carried. People listened when he spoke. They stepped aside when he walked, because everyone knew the stories. Everyone knew who he was. Bat had become a legend long before he realized it. In saloons and smoky poker halls, cowboys whispered his name like a spell, half in fear, half in admiration. "That's Bat Masterson," they'd say. "The man who faced down more gunmen than anyone else and lived to tell about it." But fame in the Wild West was a strange kind of gift. It brought free drinks and friendly smiles, but it also brought trouble. Men with something to prove, drifters looking to make a name by drawing on a legend. Every town had one, and Bat knew how fast a quiet night could turn deadly. He learned to read a room the way a scout reads the land. The tilt of a man's hat, the way a hand hovered near a belt, small signs that meant big things. He didn't look for fights, but fights often found him. And when they did, he ended them with precision, never pride. But despite the danger, Bat enjoyed this new life. He traveled from Kansas to Colorado, from New Mexico to Texas, following the trail of poker games and prize fights. The West wasn't lawless anymore, but it was still alive with opportunity. Bat had a gift for charm and showmanship, and he used it well. In Denver, he became a familiar face in the finest gambling halls. He dressed in tailored coats, wore silk ties, and carried himself like a gentleman. People who met him for the first time were often surprised. He didn't look like the kind of man who'd faced gunfire. He looked like someone who belonged in a parlor, not a gunfight. But that was the thing about Bat Masterson. He could move between worlds. He had the manners of a city man and the instincts of a survivor. One minute he was sipping champagne with businessmen. The next he was talking cards and stories with cowboys. Everyone liked him. Everyone trusted him. For a time, Bat became deeply involved in boxing, a sport that was raw, brutal, and honest, much like the frontier itself. He started managing and promoting fights, betting on matches, and traveling with the fighters. It wasn't just about money. It was about excitement. The roar of a crowd, the courage of two men in a ring. It reminded him of the courage he'd seen on the plains. Bat treated fighters the way he once treated deputies, with fairness and respect. He admired their discipline, their control. To him, a boxing match wasn't violence. It was art, but even as he enjoyed his new success, the shadow of the West still followed him. Newspapers loved to write about him. Some painted him as a hero, others as a killer. The exaggerated stories turned half-truths into headlines. "Masterson shoots again. The Dodge City sheriff returns to the gun." Bat didn't bother correcting them. He knew how stories worked. The world didn't want the quiet truth. It wanted legends. Still, not every chapter was filled with glamour. He lost money, made enemies, and found himself caught in more than one scandal. There were shootouts, there were arrests, and there were nights when he wondered if he'd ever escape the shadow of his past. But Bat always adapted. When others fell, he found another path. He could sit at a poker table with outlaws one night and dine with governors the next. That was his gift. Not the gun, not the badge, but the ability to survive change. The 1890s brought more of it. The frontier was dying. The Old West, the one filled with cattle drives, saloons, and dusty showdowns, was vanishing fast. Railroads and telegraphs connected cities. Civilization had won. Bat looked around one evening, staring at the lights of Denver spreading across the hills, and realized that the world he knew was gone. He wasn't sad, just thoughtful. He had lived through a time no one would ever see again, and he had lived it well. So he made another choice, the kind of choice that would surprise everyone. He started thinking about life beyond the West. He still had friends in high places. Men like President Theodore Roosevelt admired him. And when Roosevelt visited Denver, he made sure to see Bat. They shared a mutual respect, two men who believed in courage, discipline, and second chances. It was Roosevelt who helped him secure a small position in government, a deputy U.S. Marshal's post in New York City. It was a new beginning, a far cry from the dusty saloons of Kansas, but Bat liked the sound of it. A new city, a new life. And so, at the turn of the century, Bat Masterson packed his bags one last time. He traded the planes for the skyscrapers, the revolver for a pen, the saddle for a desk. He was no longer chasing outlaws. He was chasing stories. As the train pulled east, the land rolled by, endless, golden, and quiet. Bat watched it fade into the distance, knowing that a chapter had closed. The West had made him famous. But New York would make him immortal. The train hissed to a stop at Grand Central Station. Steam rolled through the air, and the noise of New York surrounded him. The clatter of horses, the call of newsboys, the endless rush of people. It was 1902, and Bat Masterson had arrived in a new world. The man who once rode across silent plains now stood in the center of a city that never slept. For a moment he just stood there, his polished boots on the platform, watching the endless movement. This was not Dodge City. This was not Kansas. This was the future. He was 50 years old now, older, slower, but sharper than ever. His days of gunfights and gambling were behind him. The West had made him famous, but it had also left him tired. He wanted peace, something steady, something lasting, and he found it in words. Bat Masterson, the lawman and gunfighter, became Bat Masterson, the writer. He began working for the New York Morning Telegraph, one of the city's busiest papers. His job was to write about sports, boxing mostly, but also the human stories behind it. The editor who hired him said, "You've seen courage, Bat. Now write about it." And that's exactly what he did. Every morning, he'd walk down the bustling streets in a long coat and bowler hat, greeting people with a polite nod. He was easy to spot, clean-shaven, well-dressed, with a quiet confidence that made strangers turn their heads. Few realized they were looking at one of the most feared and respected gunfighters in American history. At his desk in the newspaper office, Bat typed with purpose. The clack of the keys replaced the sound of gunfire. His words carried the same precision that once guided his hand on a revolver. He wrote about fighters, strong men in the ring, battling not just each other but life itself. He admired their bravery, their self-control, their honor. In a way, he saw himself in them. He often wrote that courage wasn't about power or speed. It was about calm, the same calm that had saved his life so many times in the West. His columns were honest, witty, and full of insight. People loved reading them. They trusted his voice because it came from experience, not imagination. When Bat described a fighter's determination or a gambler's nerve, readers could feel the truth behind the words. But even as he embraced this new life, the ghosts of the past sometimes followed him. People would stop him on the street and ask, "Mr. Masterson, is it true you once faced down a dozen outlaws?" He would smile, tip his hat, and say, "No, only 11. He didn't brag. He didn't correct. He understood that legends had their own life, and he let them live." At night, Bat often sat in his favorite bar on Broadway, sipping a quiet drink, telling stories to anyone who asked politely. His stories weren't just about gunfights. They were about choices, about honor, about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. He spoke softly, but every word carried weight. The younger journalists admired him. The fighters respected him. Even politicians sought his company. He was charming, quick-witted, and full of dry humor. In New York, Bat Masterson became something rare, a living bridge between the old world and the new. In 1903, he married Emma Walters, an actress and singer. She was intelligent, strong, and full of life, the perfect match for him. They lived comfortably in an apartment in Manhattan, surrounded by friends and laughter. After decades of wandering, Bat had finally found a home. But even in comfort, he never lost his edge. He stayed disciplined, always alert, always observing. The habits of a lawman never really left him. When fights broke out in the newsroom, he was the one who stepped in calmly and ended them with a look. Nobody wanted to cross Bat Masterson. not even in New York. As the years went on, he became a respected voice in journalism. His columns weren't just about sports. They were about life itself. He wrote about honesty, fairness, and courage, the same values that had guided him through every dusty town and dangerous street in the West. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he'd walk the empty sidewalks and think about how far he'd come. He had lived through the wildest times in American history and somehow made it to the modern age. He once joked that he'd gone from chasing buffalo to chasing deadlines. But behind the humor, there was pride. Pride in survival. Pride in reinvention. New York gave Bat something the West never could: peace. For the first time in his life, he didn't have to watch his back. He could wake up in the morning, pour a cup of coffee, and write about courage instead of testing it. Still, there was one thing that never changed: his curiosity about people. Whether they were fighters, writers, or strangers on the street, Bat saw the same spark in them all: the desire to be remembered. He understood it better than anyone. After all, he had spent his whole life walking the line between man and myth. Years passed. The guns of the frontier grew silent, and the men who had once ruled the West faded into memory. But Bat Masterson remained, older now, slower, yet sharp as ever. His typewriter, his new weapon. Every article he wrote was a piece of history, a bridge between two worlds, the dusty trails and the bright city lights. He was no longer chasing fame. He had already found it. What he was chasing now was meaning, and in every word he wrote, he found it. The years rolled by quietly. The man who once lived by the gun now lived by the pen. The West that had made him famous was gone, buried under railroads, telephone wires, and paved streets. But Bat Masterson carried it with him wherever he went. It lived in his memory, in his words, and in the calm way he faced every day. By the time he reached his 60s, Bat was known across New York as more than a sportswriter. He was a gentleman, a storyteller, a man of wisdom. People would visit his office at the New York Morning Telegraph just to hear him talk. He'd sit behind his desk, typewriter in front of him, and tell stories about Dodge City, Wyatt Earp, and the men who made the frontier what it was. But his stories weren't about violence. They were about choices. He'd say, the gun didn't make the West, the men behind it did. He had lived through chaos and seen how easily it swallowed people whole. That's why he admired the fighters he wrote about, the boxers who faced fear in the ring and never looked away. To him, a boxing match was a mirror of life itself. Two men, no weapons, just courage, timing, and will. Every morning, Bat woke early, dressed neatly in a pressed suit, and walked to the newspaper office. He was always polite, always smiling, and always punctual. Even the youngest reporters respected him. They called him Mr. Masterson, and though he laughed at the formality, he appreciated it. He lived a simple life with his wife, Emma. They had no children, but their home was warm and full of laughter. On weekends, they dined with friends or went to the theater. Sometimes they'd stroll along Broadway, arm in arm, talking about how strange it was to live in a world so different from the one he once knew. But in quiet moments, Bat often thought of the men he'd left behind: Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, Charlie Bassett. Many of them were gone now, buried under western skies. The legends they created had grown bigger than the truth. People loved the stories, but rarely understood the real men. Bat did. He remembered their laughter, their courage, and the loneliness that came with their kind of life. Sometimes, sitting at his desk late at night, he would look out the window and imagine the Old West again. The sound of horses, the smell of gunpowder, the wind blowing across open plains. He missed the freedom of it, even with all its danger. But he knew that era was over. The world had moved on. One day, a young reporter asked him, "Mr. Masterson, do you miss the old days? The gunfights, the saloons, the danger?" Bat smiled, his eyes soft but distant. "No," he said. "I miss the people." The danger was never the point. As he grew older, Bat began to write less about sport and more about human nature. His columns carried lessons about fairness, about courage, about knowing when to stand your ground. He wrote as if he were teaching the next generation, passing down something valuable before time took it away. And time was catching up. His hair had turned white, and his hands trembled slightly when he typed. But his mind was sharp, his humor intact. When friends asked how he was feeling, he'd smile and say, "Still on the right side of the dirt." he never lost his charm. Even in his final years, he dressed with care, crisp suits, polished shoes, hat always straight. He said a man's appearance was a sign of his respect for life. Then came the morning of October 25th, 1921. The air was cool, the city alive with noise. Bat arrived at the Morning Telegraph office like always, greeting everyone with a nod. He sat at his desk, placed his fingers on the typewriter, and began his next column. The words came easily, they always did. He wrote about boxing, about courage, about how defeat is only one punch away. Halfway through his article, he paused. Maybe he was thinking, maybe he was smiling at a memory, and then he was still. When the editor came to check on him, Bat was sitting upright, as if deep in thought. But the typewriter was silent. He was gone, a heart attack, quiet and sudden. The last words on his page read, "There are no bullies in the fight game, because defeat is only one punch away." Those words became his legacy, a final message from a man who had lived with courage in every form. News of his death spread quickly. Newspapers across the country ran his story. Some called him a hero, others a gentleman, others a symbol of the passing West. In New York, they mourned a writer. In Kansas, they remembered a lawman. In between, people simply remembered the man. Bat Masterson was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. His grave was simple, his name carved in stone, nothing grand, nothing loud. Just a quiet reminder of a man who had lived many lives. He had been a hunter, a lawman, a gambler, a promoter, a writer, and through it all, a gentleman. He had seen the world change and adapted with it. He never clung to the past. He simply carried it with dignity. Today, when people talk about the Old West, they speak of gunfighters and outlaws, of chaos and law. But few remember that some men stood between both worlds. Men like Bat Masterson, who proved that courage isn't about drawing first. It's about standing tall, even when the world changes around you. And so, his legend lives on, not as the fastest gun, but as the calmest heart. The news of Bat Masterson's death spread quickly, from the busy streets of New York to the quiet towns of Kansas. Newspapers across America printed his name one last time. Some called him a frontier hero, others a gunfighter turned writer, but all agreed on one thing: there would never be another like him. To the people who remembered the old days, his passing felt like the closing of a chapter, the final page of the Wild West. The world had changed. The open plains were now crossed by railroads, the small towns had become cities, and the legends who once defined an era were fading into photographs and memories. But Bat Masterson wasn't just a relic of the past. He had lived long enough to see himself become a story, and stories, once they take root, never truly die. In Dodge City, the locals spoke his name with quiet pride. Some had seen him walk the streets in his sheriff's star. Others had only heard the tales, how he brought peace without spilling unnecessary blood, how he avenged his brother's death but never glorified it. In every saloon and dusty corner of the plains, his legend grew just a little more. Hollywood was beginning to take notice. The early days of film were hungry for heroes, and the Wild West offered plenty. Names like Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, and Doc Holliday filled screens in dime novels. And somewhere among them, Bat Masterson's story found new life. But the truth of Bat's life was different from the tales that followed. In the movies, he became a fearless gunfighter, a man who solved every problem with bullets and bravado. But those who truly knew him, those who had stood beside him, would have laughed at that. Bat wasn't a man who loved gunfights. He was a man who avoided them. He believed that courage wasn't about drawing first. It was about thinking first. The real Bat Masterson had always been a man of control, calm, steady, and fair. He believed that law meant something, that justice wasn't just about revenge. The myths left that part out because legends, after all, are built on exaggeration. Still, there was something beautiful about it, the way stories took on a life of their own. The boy from Quebec who once chased buffalo had become a symbol of America's untamed spirit. He had crossed borders, both real and emotional, and had lived through every stage of his country's transformation. In New York, his friends in journalism remembered him as a professional, disciplined, witty, and sharp as ever until his last day. To them, he wasn't a gunfighter. He was a gentleman writer with a past too wild to believe. His editor once said, if Bat Masterson hadn't lived, no one would have dared to invent him, and maybe that was true. His wife, Emma, kept his memory alive quietly. She didn't seek fame or attention. She simply cherished the life they had shared, peaceful, honest, filled with laughter and respect. To her, Bat wasn't a legend. He was just a good man who had finally found peace. But the rest of the world wasn't ready to let go. Writers turned his life into stories. Some exaggerated his adventures, others romanticized his charm. And soon, Bat Masterson became not just a man from history, but an idea. He became the symbol of the man who could live through chaos and still remain civilized. The man who wore a smile instead of a scowl, a bowler hat instead of a cowboy hat. He was the gentleman in a world of gunslingers. Years later, television and radio would tell his story again, reshaped for new generations. They turned him into a clean-cut hero, brave, clever, unstoppable. And though the details weren't always true, the spirit of it was. The real Bat would have smiled at that. He knew that stories change, but character lasts forever. The truth about Bat Masterson was simple. He didn't just survive the West, he outgrew it. While others stayed trapped in the old ways, Bat moved forward, embracing the future. That's why he thrived in New York, why he could go from sheriff to sportswriter without ever losing himself. He was a man who understood something most didn't. That time moves on, and the only way to keep living is to move with it. Even today, his name carries weight. Historians write about him, storytellers borrow from his life, and countless Western films have characters inspired by him. But no matter how many versions of him appear on screen, there's always one truth that shines through. He was a man of balance, a fighter who preferred peace, a legend who stayed human. At Woodlawn Cemetery, his grave remains simple, just a stone with his name, William Barclay Masterson. No grand statue, no marble horseman, no carved revolver, because Bat never needed decoration. His life spoke for itself. If you visit his resting place today, you can almost imagine the sound of a typewriter clicking softly in the distance. The same rhythm that marked the last years of his life. Steady, thoughtful, unhurried. He once said, "Defeat is only one punch away." Maybe that was his way of saying life is fragile. But he lived every day as if he could take one more punch and keep going, and that's what made him unforgettable. Bat Masterson's story wasn't just about the Wild West. It was about transformation. From hunter to sheriff, from gunfighter to writer, from myth to man, he didn't chase fame. He didn't run from it either. He simply lived his life with courage, grace, and quiet strength. And history did the rest. Even now, a century later, the legend of Bat Masterson reminds us that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is change. Years after Bat Masterson's death, his name refused to fade. It echoed through stories told in saloons, through newspaper columns, and eventually through the new and powerful voice of America, Hollywood. By the 1930s and 1940s, the Old West had become a stage for heroes. People longed for stories of courage, adventure, and honor. The real frontier was gone, replaced by cities and machines, but the spirit of it still stirred people's hearts. And among the names whispered in those tales was Bat Masterson, the man who lived two lives and mastered them both. At first, writers of pulp novels painted him as a fierce gunfighter, quick on the draw and fearless in battle. They filled pages with imaginary duels, train robberies, and outlaws. The Bat Masterson in those stories was a cowboy superhero, charming, deadly, unstoppable. But the truth was quieter and far more powerful. The real Bat had been calm, clever, and deeply human. He avoided fights when he could, reasoned when others lost their tempers, and believed justice should never be driven by hate. But in a world hungry for drama, peace was not exciting enough. So, fiction turned him into something louder, a man of the gun instead of a man of grace. Still, Bat's legend carried something deeper than gunfights. It carried a message. Every story, whether true or exaggerated, held a piece of his character, the dignity, the charm, the ability to face change without fear. That's what made him timeless. As the years passed, the myth only grew stronger. In the 1950s, when television took over living rooms across America, Bat Masterson found new life again. A show simply called Bat Masterson appeared, starring actor Gene Barry. Millions of people tuned in each week to see the Gentleman Gunfighter in action. He wore fine suits, carried a gold-tipped cane instead of a six-shooter, and handled outlaws with wit instead of rage. The character smiled in the face of danger, talked his way out of gunfights, and walked away from violence with a bow and a clever remark. It wasn't the real Bat, but somehow it captured his spirit perfectly. Children admired him. Adults respected him. The show's theme song even said it all. Back when the West was very young, there lived a man named Masterson. He wore a cane and derby hat. They called him Bat Masterson. For a generation who never saw the real frontier, this TV version was the frontier, polite, brave, confident, and clever. It turned Bat into a pop culture icon, one of the few Western legends remembered not for violence, but for style and intelligence. And maybe that was fitting. Because even though the show glamorized him, it also preserved the part of his story that mattered most, that you could be strong without being cruel. That courage wasn't always about a quick draw, but about standing tall and keeping your composure. The Gentleman Gunfighter had become more than a man. He had become a symbol. The influence of that image reached far beyond the 1950s. Modern characters in film and television, the cool, calm heroes who think before they act, owe something to Bat Masterson. The smooth-talking detectives, the elegant spies, even the noble sheriffs who use brains over brawn, they all carry a trace of him. While Hollywood shaped the myth, historians began digging back into the truth. Writers and biographers uncovered letters, newspaper columns, and eyewitness accounts that showed who Bat really was. They discovered a man who could win with words as easily as with a gun, who lived by reason and never sought unnecessary violence. They found the humanity that the movies had left out, the laughter, the losses, the quiet pride. And as people read more about him, they began to understand that Bat's story was not just about the West, but about transformation, about how one man could live through chaos and still evolve with grace. In many ways, Bat Masterson represented the American story itself. A man born in the wilderness who found peace in civilization. A man who learned that survival wasn't about how fast you could shoot, but how well you could adapt. His journey, from buffalo hunter to sheriff, gambler to journalist, mirrored the country's own shift from wild frontier to modern nation. He didn't resist the change. He embraced it. And that's what made him different from most legends of the West. Even now, more than a century later, his story still captures something eternal, the struggle between violence and reason, chaos and order, past and progress. When people visit his grave in Woodlawn Cemetery, they often leave small notes or canes, tributes to the man who stood tall without needing to draw his gun. They honor not the outlaw image that fiction gave him, but the real man who proved that civility and courage can live side by side. It's strange how life works. The boy from Canada, who once chased buffalo across endless plains, became one of the most recognizable figures in American culture. Not because he shouted the loudest or fought the hardest, but because he lived with quiet dignity. And that is why, long after the dust of the West has settled, people still speak his name, Bat Masterson, the man who tamed the Wild West not with bullets, but with calm. Long before Bat Masterson was a legend, he was just a man finding his way through a wild and unpredictable frontier. And along that journey, he met another man who would change the course of his life, Wyatt Earp. Their paths crossed in Dodge City, Kansas, a place where law and chaos shared the same street. Wyatt was a tall, serious lawman with sharp eyes and a quiet voice. Bat was younger then, confident but not reckless, sharp-minded but calm. Together they became an unlikely pair. Two men bound by a simple belief, that justice should have a steady hand, not a quick trigger. Dodge City in the 1870s was a place where tempers burned faster than lantern oil. Every night gunfire echoed between the saloons. And every morning someone new was buried on Boot Hill. The cattle drives brought money and life to the town, but they also brought trouble. Cowboys with whiskey in their blood and pistols on their hips. Bat and Wyatt stood in the middle of it all. They didn't just enforce the law. They were the law. They shared more than a job. They shared a code. Both men believed that being brave didn't mean being violent. It meant staying calm when others panicked, thinking when others shot. They trusted each other completely. When one spoke, the other listened. When one drew his gun, the other was already ready. Many people saw them as heroes. Others saw them as targets. But either way, everyone respected them. Together, they made Dodge City safer. One conversation, one arrest, one act of courage at a time. Their friendship was built not just on duty, but on understanding. Wyatt admired Bat's self-control and kindness. Bat admired Wyatt's determination and quiet strength. In a world full of reckless men, they were rare, lawmen who didn't want bloodshed. When Wyatt later moved on to Tombstone, Arizona, the town that would make him famous after the gunfight at the OK Corral, Bat stayed behind for a time. He had his own battles to fight, his own ghosts to face. But even when they were miles apart, the two men stayed connected. They wrote to each other often. Their letters were respectful, warm, and full of shared memories. They talked about the West, about the old days, about how the world was changing faster than either of them had imagined. Years later, when Bat became a writer in New York, he still received letters from Wyatt Earp. Wyatt, now older and living in California, often sent him notes about his life and his own stories being exaggerated by newspapers. He'd tell Bat, "They print what they please, but we know what really happened." Bat would smile reading those words. He knew exactly what Wyatt meant. By then, they were both legends, their names printed in books and newspapers, their deeds stretched beyond recognition. But beneath all the myth, they were still the same men who once stood side by side on Front Street, facing down danger without a word. Their bond was more than friendship. It was brotherhood. In the 1910s, when Wyatt visited New York, he made sure to see Bat. The two old lawmen sat together in a quiet restaurant, far from the noise of the city. They talked for hours about the past, about Dodge, about the people they'd known, about the ones they'd lost. There was laughter, but also silence, the kind that comes when two men know how much time has passed and how much can never be repeated. Wyatt later said that seeing Bat again was like seeing a piece of the West come back to life. "He never changed," Wyatt told a reporter. Still sharp, still proud, still Bat. Bat admired Wyatt too, not as a hero from the headlines, but as a man who had done his best in a violent world. When people tried to speak badly of Earp, Bat defended him fiercely. He once wrote in a column that Wyatt Earp was one of the bravest and most honorable men I ever knew. The respect between them lasted until the end. When Bat died in 1921, Wyatt was heartbroken. He received the news in California and wrote to a friend, saying that the world had lost a good man, one of the last true gentlemen of the frontier. Wyatt himself would pass away only 8 years later in 1929. Their friendship became part of Western legend, retold countless times in books, movies, and TV shows. But the truth was simpler and more powerful. Two men who lived by honor in a time when honor was rare. The bond between Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp wasn't built on fame or fortune. It was built on trust, on shared danger, shared values, and a shared understanding that the line between law and chaos was often just one heartbeat wide. And maybe that's why, even now, their names are spoken together, Earp and Masterson. Two men from a vanished world who carried its lessons into the modern age. They stood not for violence, but for restraint. Not for revenge, but for reason. And that, perhaps, is why they still matter. Because even as the myths grow larger and the stories more dramatic, the truth remains the same. Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp were proof that integrity can shine brighter than any gunfire. Long after Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp were gone, the world kept telling their stories. But somehow Bat's story always stood apart. His name didn't echo as loudly in the old Western films about dusty duels or revenge-filled shootouts. Instead, it lingered quietly, in the calm, composed heroes who appeared on screen decades later. He was never the fastest gun or the loudest lawman. Yet his kind of courage left a deeper mark. It was the courage of control, the kind that never needed to shout to be heard. In the years after his death, America itself began to change once again. The frontier that once stretched endlessly under the sun had been replaced by cities and machines. Cowboys were gone. Now there were businessmen, soldiers, and dreamers. But in all of them, the spirit of men like Bat Masterson lived on. The belief that honor and reason could still matter in a rough world. Writers rediscovered him first. They went through his old newspaper columns, his letters, and his interviews. What they found surprised them. They didn't find a violent outlaw or a heartless gunfighter. They found a thinker, a philosopher of courage. His columns were full of life lessons hidden between boxing stories. He wrote about fairness, discipline, pride, and the importance of staying calm under pressure. A man, he once wrote, who cannot control his temper, cannot control his destiny. That sentence alone could have been the headline for his entire life. Hollywood soon caught on, but it wasn't the early westerns that reflected him. It was the later ones, the quiet, thoughtful heroes who stood their ground without needing to pull the trigger. You could see pieces of Bat Masterson in them all, in the calm sheriff who waits before acting, in the detective who solves a case with his mind instead of his fists, in the soldier who values discipline over rage. His legacy stretched beyond the screen. Generations of writers and filmmakers admired his balance, that mix of civility and toughness, of charm and restraint. In an age that often glorified violence, Bat Masterson reminded them that true strength could be silent. He became a model for the modern hero, the gentleman warrior. Not a man of chaos, but a man of principle. Even in popular culture, his image carried meaning. When the Bat Masterson TV show aired in the 1950s, it wasn't just entertainment. It was a reflection of post-war America's hope. That strength could coexist with decency, that civilization could emerge from violence. The man with the cane, the derby hat, and the calm smile stood as a symbol of what the country wanted to believe about itself. Brave, fair and civilized, and while most legends fade with time, Bat stayed alive in quiet ways. His name appeared in songs, novels, and documentaries. Historians dug deeper into the man behind the myth, revealing details that made him even more human. His humor, his compassion, his intelligence. They discovered that when he wasn't writing or working, Bat often helped young fighters and reporters find their footing. He gave advice freely, never asked for praise, and treated everyone, rich or poor, with respect. That generosity of spirit was something people rarely associated with gunslingers. But for Bat, it was second nature in a way. His greatest victory was not what he did during his lifetime, but what he inspired afterward. His story showed that a man could change without losing himself. That transformation wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. From a boy on the plains of Kansas to a sheriff in Dodge City, from a gambler to a writer in New York, Bat's journey became a symbol of growth, of how a man can move from violence to peace, from chaos to reflection. That idea struck deeply with readers in the 20th century, especially during times of war and change. Soldiers read about him and saw something familiar, the calm under pressure, the quiet sense of duty. Writers saw his duality, the roughness of his past balanced by the refinement of his later years. In classrooms, in books, and in film scripts, Bat Masterson's name began to represent something bigger than the West. He represented evolution. He was proof that history isn't just about who draws fastest or who wins the fight. It's about who learns from it, who grows, who adapts, who becomes better. Even today, when people talk about heroes, real or fictional, you can trace their roots back to men like him. The heroes who don't boast, who lead by example, who believe that kindness can coexist with courage. In an era where loudness often wins attention, Bat Masterson's life whispers a timeless truth. Dignity never goes out of style. His calmness, his grace, his quiet confidence, those were his weapons. And they've outlived every gun and every outlaw of his time. Standing at his grave today, under the shade of New York trees, you wouldn't think of the wild plains or the sound of gunfire. You'd think of something softer. The click of typewriter keys, the voice of a man who believed that the world could always become better if you met it with respect and strength. Bat Masterson didn't just live history. He became its lesson, and that's why, even now, his story doesn't end. It keeps echoing, in every calm hero who chooses wisdom over rage, in every quiet man who stands tall in the face of chaos, and in every writer who tells stories that matter. Bat Masterson's life reminds us that the greatest legends aren't the ones who conquer the world. They're the ones who learn how to live in it with grace. The story of Bat Masterson doesn't end with his death. It never really could, because men like Bat don't just live in history books. They live in the stories people tell, in the values they pass down, and in the quiet idea that courage can wear a smile, More than a century has passed since he took his last breath at that typewriter in New York City. The sound of gunfire that once echoed across the plains has long faded. The streets of Dodge City are now paved, the saloons turned into quiet landmarks. But somewhere, in every story about the West, the shadow of Bat Masterson still walks, calm, collected, and unmistakably human. He was a man who belonged to two worlds, the Old West and the New America. And he mastered both. In the West, he faced chaos, lawlessness, violence, and loss. In the East, he found peace, order, intellect, and art. Few men made that journey. Fewer still made it with grace. Bat did. People often ask what made him different from other lawmen, from the countless gunslingers whose names fill history. The answer is simple. Bat Masterson never fought for fame. He fought for peace. He didn't draw his gun because he wanted to. He drew it because he had to. And when the fighting was done, he put it away without pride. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man doing what was necessary in his time, no more, no less. That humility, that balance between strength and restraint, is what made him timeless. In his later years, when asked if he missed the wild days of the West, Bat smiled and said, "I miss the people, not the trouble." That one sentence captured everything about him. Nostalgia without regret, memory without bitterness. The truth is, Bat Masterson lived a full life not because he sought adventure, but because he accepted change. He understood something most people struggle with, that you can't stop the world from moving forward, but you can walk with it, head held high. He was proof that transformation is not weakness. It's evolution, from buffalo hunter to sheriff, from gambler to journalist, from gunfighter to gentleman. His life was a journey of constant reinvention. Every chapter reflected a different part of the human story: courage, loss, wisdom, and renewal. In a way, his story mirrors the story of America itself. Wild at first, then wiser, more reflective, learning to replace the gun with the pen, the fight with the word. He helped build the idea that law could exist in a lawless land, that reason could outlast rage, and that a man could be both strong and kind. Those lessons didn't end when the West did. They carried into modern times, into every courtroom, every newsroom, every story where justice still matters. In New York, where he spent his final years, his memory lingers like an echo of a world that once was. The city has changed 1,000 times since then, but the spot where he wrote his final words still feels like hallowed ground. He didn't die with a gun in his hand. He died with ideas, and that made him immortal. Visitors who find his grave in Woodlawn Cemetery often describe the same feeling: quiet awe. The simple stone bears no dramatic words, just his name: William Barclay Masterson, 1853 to 1921. It doesn't tell his story. It doesn't need to. The silence around it speaks louder than any legend. For those who know, that name is enough, because that name carries a legacy of courage without cruelty, power without arrogance, confidence without noise. His life taught something the world still needs to hear: that the real measure of a man isn't how fast he draws, but how calmly he lives. The old myths of the Wild West were filled with men who conquered, who killed, who ruled by fear. But Bat Masterson's myth endures for the opposite reason. He ruled by presence, by reason, by dignity. He showed that you could be brave and kind at the same time, that you could wear a gun and still prefer to talk, that you could walk away from violence and still be called strong. That's why his story still matters. Because it isn't just a story about the past. It's a story about choice. Bat Masterson's life reminds us that everyone faces a moment where they must decide who they are. Do they hold on to the old ways, or do they grow? Do they fight to prove something, or do they stand to protect something? Bat chose to grow, and that choice made him more than a legend. It made him an example of balance, of evolution, of what it means to be truly human. Today, when someone says Bat Masterson, most think of the gentleman in a derby hat with a cane instead of a revolver. But behind that image stands a man who lived through the harshest age and still chose grace over fury. He didn't just live history, he transcended it. And that's why, even now, when the wind moves softly across the plains of Kansas, or whispers through the streets of New York, it carries a faint echo, the echo of a man who lived bravely, loved deeply, and wrote his own legend one quiet day at a time. Bat Masterson, the Gentleman Gunfighter. Not just a man of the West, but a man for all time.